Ethan Lawson adjusted his tie, just a little off-center, not by choice, but because it had been that kind of morning. His suit, slightly worn, didn't scream confidence, but his posture did. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to fight. The courtroom was already against him before he even spoke. The polished wooden benches were filled with murmuring spectators, most of them siding with the corporate machine that had brought him here. Titan Financial Group was a powerhouse, and their lead attorney, Wesley Carrington, was the kind of man who didn't lose. Judge Samuel Decker sat at the bench, his expression unreadable as he glanced down at the case file. A light tap of the gavel signaled for silence. He leaned forward slightly, peering over his glasses at Ethan. "Mr. Lawson, you're representing yourself?" The question dripped with skepticism. Ethan met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle rippled through the courtroom, mostly from Titan Financial side. Wesley Carrington, the seasoned attorney with a flawless track record, adjusted his cufflinks and exchanged a knowing glance with his assistant. "This should be quick," he murmured, just loud enough for Ethan to hear. Ethan ignored it. He had been underestimated before. It didn't bother him. What mattered was the case. The fight to keep his late mother's home from being swallowed by a corporation that saw families as numbers on a spreadsheet. Judge Decker let out a slow sigh, flipping through the file. "This is a property dispute, a foreclosure challenge?" Ethan gave a firm nod. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge barely looked up. "And you believe you can argue this case against an attorney of Mr. Carrington's experience?" "I don't believe, Your Honor," Ethan said calmly. "I know." The courtroom hushed. A few muffled chuckles remained, but there was something else now, an unspoken tension. A flicker of interest passed across Judge Decker's face, but it was gone just as quickly. "Well," the judge said, tapping his gavel once. "Let's proceed." Wesley Carrington stood, buttoning his jacket with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. His voice was smooth, measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is straightforward," he began, his tone almost casual. "We have a man who refuses to accept reality. The foreclosure was legal. The documents are clear. My client followed the law and Mr. Lawson did not." He paused, turning slightly toward Ethan without really looking at him. "I sympathize. Losing a home is difficult. But emotions don't override legal obligations. The numbers don't lie." Carrington returned to his seat, hands folded, as if the case was already decided. Ethan sat still, unmoved. He had expected this. He had spent 6 months preparing for this moment. They thought this was over before it started. They had no idea what was coming. Wesley Carrington leaned back in his chair, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. This wasn't a challenge. It was a routine. He had spent years dismantling cases just like this. People who thought passion could replace legal expertise. Ethan Lawson, however, didn't flinch. He had spent too many nights studying foreclosure law, poring over cases where people lost their homes not because they were irresponsible, but because the system was stacked against them. Judge Samuel Decker turned his attention back to Ethan. "You may present your opening argument, Mr. Lawson." Ethan stood, buttoning his jacket, steadying himself. The weight of the room pressed down on him, but he pushed through it. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm but controlled. "Mr. Carrington says this case is simple, that the law is clear, and in many ways he's right. The law is clear. The question is, did his client actually follow it?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Carrington's face. He had expected hesitation, nervous fumbling. Instead, Ethan spoke with certainty. Ethan continued, walking slowly as he addressed the room. "For the past 6 months I have studied every case, every statute, and every loophole corporations use to strip homes away from families. And I found something. Judge Decker leaned slightly forward. Something? Ethan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And it changes everything. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Carrington let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. This should be good. Ethan ignored him and turned to the judge. Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official request for discovery. I believe Titan Financial is withholding critical documents related to this foreclosure. The air in the courtroom shifted. Carrington's smirk faded. Judge Decker sat up straighter, now fully engaged. Hiding what, Mr. Lawson? The judge asked, his tone sharper than before. Ethan met his gaze. Fraud. The word hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. The reaction was immediate. Whispers, gasps, a low rumble of conversation. Carrington's jaw tightened. Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to stall the inevitable. Ethan tilted his head. Is it? Because I've reviewed the original mortgage documents, and there's a serious discrepancy. He walked over to his table, pulling out 2 pieces of paper. These are 2 copies of the same mortgage agreement. One from the initial filing, one from a later modification. If you look at the signatures, you'll notice something strange. He handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. Decker's brow furrowed as he examined the papers. Carrington's voice was tight. Signatures change over time, Mr. Lawson. That's hardly proof of anything. Ethan didn't hesitate. Maybe. But the second signature was made the day after my mother was hospitalized for a stroke. The courtroom gasped again. Even the jury leaned forward. Judge Decker turned back to Carrington. Does Titan Financial have the original signed documents on file? Carrington hesitated, just for a second, but Ethan saw it, and so did the judge. The silence in the courtroom felt heavier now. The confidence that had radiated from Wesley Carrington at the start of the trial was starting to waver. He wasn't laughing anymore. Judge Samuel Decker examined the documents in front of him. His fingers tapped lightly against the bench, a habit that suggested he was processing something deeper than what had initially seemed like an open and shut case. Ethan Lawson stayed standing, watching every movement, every shift in expression. He had spent months preparing for this moment. Now, the cracks in Titan Financial's case were beginning to show. Mr. Carrington, Judge Decker said, adjusting his glasses, do you have an immediate response to this discrepancy? Carrington exhaled sharply. Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to manipulate the court's perception. Signatures can vary slightly, especially over time. There is no substantial proof that this is anything more than a minor inconsistency. Ethan took a step forward. With all due respect, Your Honor, that minor inconsistency is the foundation of Titan Financial's entire case. If the signature on that modification was forged, then the foreclosure itself was illegal. Judge Decker didn't respond right away. Instead, he flipped through the pages again, his expression unreadable. Carrington, sensing an opportunity to regain control, straightened his tie and stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to remind the court that Mr. Lawson is not a legal professional. He is attempting to turn this into a spectacle, rather than focusing on the law. Ethan let the insult pass. He wasn't here to win an argument. He was here to win the case. Mr. Carrington, Ethan said calmly, can you confirm that Titan Financial possesses the original signed documents with my mother's verified signature? Carrington hesitated. It was a brief moment, barely noticeable to most, but to Ethan it was everything. It will take time to retrieve, Carrington finally answered. Ethan nodded. That's fine. I can wait. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The balance of power was shifting. Judge Decker closed the file and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carrington? I will give Titan Financial time to produce the original documents. But if they cannot provide them, we will have a very different conversation." Carrington's jaw tightened. He gave a sharp nod and sat down. Ethan remained standing. He wasn't finished yet. "Your Honor, while we wait, I'd like to introduce something else into evidence," Ethan said, walking over to his table. He picked up another folder and handed it to the bailiff. Judge Decker accepted the folder and opened it. His brow furrowed as he skimmed the pages. "These are records of multiple foreclosure cases handled by Titan Financial," Ethan explained. "And they all have something in common, signature discrepancies just like this one." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Even Judge Decker looked intrigued. Ethan had just taken his first real strike. And he wasn't stopping now. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. What started as a routine foreclosure case had now turned into something else, something far more serious. Judge Samuel Decker flipped through the pages Ethan Lawson had submitted, his brows knitting together in concentration. The murmurs in the gallery had died down as everyone waited for what would happen next. Across the aisle, Wesley Carrington sat rigid, his usual air of confidence fractured. The smirk that had once curled at the corners of his lips was gone. "Mr. Carrington," Judge Decker said, his voice steady but firmer than before, "do you have any immediate explanation for why multiple foreclosure cases involving Titan Financial show similar inconsistencies?" Carrington cleared his throat, reaching for his notes as if searching for a response. "Your Honor, these are unverified claims presented by someone with no legal background. There is no concrete evidence of wrongdoing." Ethan stepped forward. "No concrete evidence? Then let's find some." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally request a forensic analysis of these documents to verify the authenticity of the signatures." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a direct accusation. Carrington straightened. "Your Honor, this is a delaying tactic. The defendant is attempting to drag this out in hopes of avoiding the inevitable." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm trying to prove whether my mother's home was taken legally or not. If Titan Financial followed the law, then they have nothing to worry about." Judge Decker tapped his fingers against the bench, considering. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Finally he exhaled. "I find Mr. Lawson's request reasonable. The court will order an independent forensic review of these documents." Carrington's composure cracked. "Your Honor, this is unnecessary. The paperwork is legitimate." Decker gave him a measured look. "Then the forensic analysis will confirm that, won't it?" The attorney's jaw tightened. He knew he had no choice but to comply. Ethan wasn't finished. "While we wait for the results, Your Honor, there's one more issue I'd like to bring up." Judge Decker sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Go on." Ethan turned to the gallery. "The foreclosure process is supposed to follow strict legal procedures. But what if I told you that Titan Financial wasn't even legally allowed to foreclose on this house?" The murmurs returned. Even Judge Decker looked intrigued. "Explain." Ethan held up another document. "The mortgage was transferred 3 times, but the last lender, the one who filed for foreclosure, never received proper ownership of the loan. Meaning they never had the right to take the house in the first place." Carrington's face darkened. "Your Honor, this is baseless." Decker held up a hand. "It's a serious claim, and if true, it changes everything." The weight of the courtroom pressed down as Ethan met Carrington's glare. The battle wasn't over. It was just getting started. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. For the first time, Wesley Carrington didn't have an immediate response. His usual quick-witted rebuttals were gone, replaced by a rigid posture and a clenched jaw. Judge Samuel Decker exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Lawson, what exactly are you suggesting here?" Ethan Lawson didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice steady and deliberate. Your Honor, I'm suggesting that Titan Financial has engaged in a pattern of misconduct, one that goes beyond my mother's home, and I can prove it. Carrington let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. This is getting ridiculous. Ethan ignored him and turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Carrington stiffened. A witness, he repeated, his voice tight. Judge Decker's eyes narrowed. Mr. Lawson, this witness. Were they disclosed prior to today? Ethan nodded. No, Your Honor. I only tracked her down yesterday. And what she told me... He let the words hang for a moment. Changes everything. The tension in the room thickened as the back doors of the courtroom creaked open. A woman stepped in hesitantly, adjusting her glasses. Your Honor, Ethan continued, this is Rebecca Miles, a licensed notary public. She was the one who notarized the second mortgage modification. The one, I believe, was forged. Carrington immediately stood. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This witness should have been disclosed in advance. Judge Decker glanced at Ethan. Mr. Lawson, why is this the first time we're hearing from Miss Miles? Because I didn't know if I'd find her in time, Ethan admitted. But I did. And she has direct knowledge of what happened with that document. The judge considered for a long moment before finally nodding. I'll allow it. Carrington sat down abruptly, his fingers tapping against the table. He knew this wasn't going his way. Rebecca Miles took the stand. She swallowed hard as she adjusted the microphone. State your full name and occupation for the record, Judge Decker instructed. Rebecca Miles, she said, voice slightly shaky. I'm a licensed notary public. Ethan stepped forward. Ms. Miles, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage modification for my mother's home? She hesitated before nodding. I do. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers. And were you present when she signed it? The pause was just a second too long. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, No, I wasn't. The courtroom exploded with whispers. Ethan turned to the judge. Your Honor, she just admitted that the signature was notarized without verification, making the entire foreclosure process illegal. Carrington paled. He had just lost his strongest defense. And Ethan wasn't done yet. The courtroom was no longer just a legal battleground. It was a spectacle. The carefully crafted case Wesley Carrington had built was crumbling right in front of him, piece by piece. Judge Samuel Decker leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he observed the scene before him. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of the last testimony still lingering in the air. Mr. Carrington, the judge said, his voice even but firm. Do you have an explanation for why this document was notarized without proper verification? Carrington adjusted his tie, his confidence fading fast. Your Honor, this is an oversight, nothing more. A clerical mistake at worst. It does not change the fact that the foreclosure was lawful. Ethan Lawson stepped forward before the judge could respond. Your Honor, an oversight is when someone forgets to file a form. This is fraud. A legally binding document was approved without verification. That alone invalidates the foreclosure. Judge Decker turned his attention back to Carrington. Does Titan Financial have an original, legally verified signature from the homeowner on this modification? Carrington hesitated. Too long. Ethan seized the moment. That's what I thought. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The jury was leaning forward. Even Judge Decker seemed to sit up straighter, fully invested now. Ethan wasn't finished. He pulled out another document and handed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, this is a report I compiled on Titan Financial's foreclosure history. Turns out, my mother's case isn't the only one where questionable documents were used to seize property. Judge Decker scanned the pages, his expression darkening. He exhaled sharply, then fixed his gaze on Carrington. Mr. Carrington, are you telling this court that Titan Financial has no knowledge of these repeated irregularities? Carrington cleared his throat, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Your Honor, we would need time to review these allegations. Ethan folded his arms. Of course you would. The courtroom erupted into hushed discussions. The tide had fully turned. Judge Decker tapped his gavel, silencing the room. Enough. His voice carried the weight of finality. He turned to Ethan. Mr. Lawson, given the evidence presented, I find sufficient grounds to invalidate this foreclosure. The property must be returned immediately. The room fell silent. Then, a wave of reaction swept through. Shock, disbelief, and something else. Satisfaction. Carrington sat frozen, the arrogance stripped away. He had walked into this courtroom expecting a victory. Instead, he had been publicly dismantled. Ethan let out a breath, his hands unclenching for the first time since the trial started. He had done it. But more than just winning, he had proven that the underestimated could fight back. Ethan Lawson stepped out of the courthouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. The air felt different, not lighter, not freer, but real. The kind of real that settles in when a fight is finally over. The murmurs of the courtroom still echoed behind him. People whispered as they passed, their voices filled with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Did you see that? Man just took down Titan Financial. Should be a lawyer. Ethan let the words drift past him. He hadn't done this for recognition. He hadn't even done it for revenge. He did it because it was right. His mother's home. The place where he had grown up, where memories were built, was safe. That was all that mattered. A voice called out behind him, Lawson. Ethan turned to see Judge Samuel Decker standing at the top of the steps, hands in his pockets. The skepticism from earlier was gone, replaced with something more measured. You surprised me in there, Decker said, watching him closely. Ethan gave a small shrug. You weren't the only one. The judge smirked slightly, just for a second, before his expression turned serious again. You ever think about law school? Decker asked. Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Not really. Decker studied him for a moment, then nodded. Might want to reconsider. You've got a talent for making people squirm. With that, he turned and disappeared back into the courthouse. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders, the tension from the past few months slowly fading. Maybe law school, maybe not. But one thing was certain. If anyone ever tried to take what was his again, they'd better be ready for a fight. Because power doesn't just belong to the ones with money and titles. It belongs to the ones who refuse to back down. And if this case proved anything, it was this. The underestimated always have the most to prove. And when given the chance, they don't just win, they change everything. This story isn't just about winning a case. It's about fighting back, even when the odds are stacked against you. Ethan Lawson didn't have a law degree. He didn't have a powerful firm backing him. But what he did have was determination, knowledge, and the courage to stand his ground. And in the end, that was enough to bring down a corporate giant. This case proves one thing: power isn't just reserved for the wealthy and the privileged. It belongs to those who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to back down, and who are willing to fight for what's right. How many people out there have lost their homes, their livelihoods, their rights, simply because they didn't have the resources or the legal expertise to fight back? Ethan's story reminds us that the system isn't unbeatable. If you know your rights, educate yourself, and refuse to give in, You can turn the tide. What do you think? Have you ever felt underestimated? Have you ever had to fight for something that others thought you couldn't win? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If this story inspired you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories of resilience, justice, and unexpected victories. Because in the real world, the fight for justice doesn't end here.